Hey guys, Christy here. Are you ready to wrap up chapter 4? So my slide for this section is called Finally the End of Chapter 4. And in this video, I'm going to wrap things up that in chapter 4. We're going to talk very briefly about Karen's mystical perspective on the people that she's writing about. And I'm going to give some critiques of what she does in the last bit of the book that we haven't, or this chapter that we haven't covered yet. And then I want to go back to the attributes of Yahweh that we set up in chapter 2 and then have sort of disappeared because Karen, it's not really a history of God, it's a history of Karen's idea of what religion should be, and compare the God of the Trinity to Yahweh that we saw back, who was being worshipped by the Jews. So as I may have mentioned, I finally twigged to the fact that Karen is a mystic, and this whole book is her mystical agenda, basically her take on what religion ought to be and how everybody else has misunderstood it except for the mystics. So that's now how I've sort of started to read everything and interpret it. And her Trinity chapter, as we saw, spends some time on the Trinity, but she really spends more time on things that reflect her worldview and what her idea of spirituality is. So after the Trinity discussion, Karen moves on to her pet theme, and she's writing about St. Basil here. He was simply calling attention to the fact that not all religious truth was capable of being expressed and defined clearly and logically. Some religious insights had an inner resonance that could only be apprehended by each individual in his own time during contemplation. And she then goes on to mention a throwaway comment that I actually think is really key to understanding Karen's entire worldview. She writes, as Gregory of Nyssa said, every concept of God is a mere simulacrum, a false likeness, an idol. It could never reveal God himself. I wish she would have put this in the introduction, but the idea of a simulacrum, for those people who might not know, is, let's say, a lucky rabbit's foot. A lucky rabbit's foot is a simulacrum. If you look at the rabbit's foot and you consider it as having magical properties and you treat it as having magical properties, then to you it's a magical item. It's not really a magical item, but when you engage with it, you simulate the experience of possessing a magical item. And that is what Karen is saying about the concept, every concept of God. I would agree. Every concept of God is a simulacrum, but it doesn't reflect anything in reality. It only reflects back to the person their own notions of God. So it's not an external simulacrum, just like the magical rabbit's foot's not really magical. The concept of God is not really God. It's the person's own feeling of what it would be like if there was a God that existed, the God that they think of existing. If it actually existed, then that's what their experience is. So in this way, Karen and I agree. We just disagree about where the basis of the simulacrum is located. So she then moves on to Augustine, and as with the Jewish prophets who she spent most of the time on in exclusion to the rest of the biblical texts, she points to the parallel between them and Augustine's conversion, and she calls it an affair of Sturm und Drang, a violent wrench from his past and a painful rebirth. And we saw this with the prophets, the idea of, being called to God and it being a very painful experience. But she then goes on to say that it could be a source of joy as well, and after his conversion, he experienced this religious ecstasy. And then she writes again, God, therefore, was not an objective reality, but a spiritual presence in the complex depths of the self. I don't even know what that means. How do you have how do you have a spiritual presence in the complex depths of the self? Anyway. Now I've entitled this slide, Augustine's Empty Speculation, because what Karen then spends a lot of time on is describing what people made up to describe what their idea of God is that has no basis in reality. It's purely their opinion. And that to me is speculation. It's empty speculation. So that's what I call it. So according to Karen, Augustine thought that since God had made us in his own image, we should be able to discern a trinity in the depths of our minds. According to this idea, within the soul, don't know what that is, there are 3 properties: memory, understanding, and will, corresponding to knowledge, self-knowledge, and love. That sounds more like the brain, not the soul, but moving on. She writes that Augustine believed that the Trinity in the mind was also a reflection that included the presence of God and was directed toward him. And this is why I call it empty speculation, because that's just talking crap. You can say that and it's interesting to listen to, but unless you can demonstrate it to me, it's just talking. It's not reality. She moves on to the notion of original sin, and that Augustine believed that God had condemned humanity to an eternal damnation simply because of Adam's one sin. This inherited guilt was passed on to his descendants through the sexual act. And what was wrong with the sex act in particular was that it was the emphasis on the irrational desire to take pleasure in mere creatures instead of God. And then, by implication, Augustine's harsh doctrine paints a terrible picture, she says, of an implacable God. And it would make sense that Karen doesn't like this idea of God and rejects it as being invalid because it goes against her mystical idea of God being a woo-woo, fuzzy, lovey thing that is just, ooh, makes everybody feel good. Karen then spends a number of paragraphs on a forgery. There was a document written that was highly influential in Christianity. It appeared somewhere around 4th or 5th, 6th century. I forgot that I'm sorry that I don't have the exact dates, but it's a forgery, so who cares what it says because it's a bunch of lies. But it was quite influential because it was accepted as legitimate until about the 15th century. And I believe the name of it's called Denis, maybe? But it's also known as pseudo-Denis because it's pseudographical. In other words, it's a forgery. So the reason why Karen wants to spend time talking about this forger is because he says lots of things that she likes. So she writes, he agreed with the Cappadocians that all our words and concepts for God were inadequate and must not be taken as an accurate description of a reality which lies beyond our ken. Even the word God itself was faulty, since God was above God. God is above God? Again, they just say words that sound really profound but are meaningless. So as we can see, authenticity of a text is completely irrelevant to Karen as long as the author is allowing her to put forward her own worldview and her justification for her mystical take of gods. The last thing that Karen is going to be doing in this chapter is just setting up a juxtaposition between the Greek church and the Latin church. She says that the Greek and Latins developed significantly different views of the divinity of Christ. The Greek church believed, according to Karen, that human beings would only fulfill themselves when they had been united to God. And in the Western church, she contrasts, sin is such an affront to God that atonement was necessary if God's plans for humanity were not to be entirely thwarted. So it was more of a legalistic scheme that depicted God, as she writes, thinking, judging, and weighing things up as though he were a human being. So you can tell that Karen really doesn't like the Western church's take of God, but she really likes the Eastern church's take on God. Now to wrap it up, I'm going to discuss the attributes that we saw at the end of chapter 2. We saw the evolution of Yahweh in chapters 1 and 2 to become increasingly more, let's say, Greek. He became more transcendent. He became the only God, the only valid God. And he acquired a lot of characteristics that he did not have earlier when he was a tribal god or a local god. It's very difficult to compare these ideas because the Trinity is just such an other thing. So on this slide, which I've entitled Meet the New God, Not the Same as the Old God, we're going to look really at Yahweh being replaced by the Trinity. It's very difficult, as I said, to compare these because they're almost two different ways of seeing God that are completely incompatible. So in the Trinitarian view, God is a prime mover and unchanging, while Jesus seems to be the part of it that can come down to earth and change. God still has all the omnis, but none of the negatives. God is both personal in the person of Christ and transcendent, in being aloof and unreachable. God is both holy and human in this way because the idea of Jesus being born a God is supposed to connect him with humanity, but also his holiness is transcendent and no longer tied to ritual. So while in Judaism we saw the need for ritual purity and religious ceremony in order to keep a connection to the divine, that no longer exists. That seems to have been replaced by the personage of Jesus. So you no longer have to engage in any kind of rituals to be pure. You have to go through Jesus to be pure. pure to get to God. So again, God is behind a veil, but what that veil is changes. In Judaism, it's ritual. In Christianity, the veil is Jesus. In terms of justice, God's divine justice is based on right belief, not on practices, and not on works, and not on ritual. God is moral in that anything that God does is moral. Divine command theory, I think it is. And there is a big emphasis on God's love, but this love does not mitigate any kind of punishment that he is going to dole out. And finally, inspiration now does not come from God. God no longer exists, really. I mean, God is a silent partner in the Trinity. He doesn't do any of the talking. Everything is mediated through Jesus. Jesus is the middleman of the Trinity. And so God is not making any personal appearances anymore. It's through the personage of Jesus that communication would be taking place. So you say things in the name of Jesus, like invoking a spell, and by invoking the name of Jesus, then God will pay attention to you, even though Jesus is God and God is Jesus. But you still have to use Jesus' name and ask for things in Jesus' name to God, because if you don't use Jesus' name, God won't know it or hear it, even though he's God. It doesn't make sense. That's why it sounds stupid. And that's it. We're pretty much done with the Trinity, when the chapter that was really not about the Trinity, and the chapter on Jesus, that really wasn't a chapter on Jesus. And next we're going to be moving on to Islam, which is not about the God of Islam. It's a biography of Muhammad. So what I'm going to try to put together the next 2 chapters, because she's got 2 on Islam that are not really histories of God. They are histories of Muhammad. And since we're not interested in the history of Muhammad, I'm going to go over it and just look at how the God of Muhammad changes over the course of his lifetime, and then how the God of Islam changes after the death of Muhammad. So we'll see how quickly I get through that. I have read the chapters, but I've been very terribly busy. So it might be the case that I won't be able to get all of that done in the next week, but I will try to get it done within the next 2 weeks. And until then, I'll still be putting up content to keep you guys entertained at least once a week, if not more often, if I can. And I will be very shortly doing my question and answer session. I got really interesting questions, so I'll be recording that as soon as I get some more time and energy. But until then, till the next time we see each other, I've been Christy, you've been awesome, and I'll see you whenever I get around to recording Different Atheist Reads: A History of God by Karen Armstrong.